This is Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is also Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina.
It's a place that has absorbed, I think, a lot of foreign aid, but has not become productive economically. It's a place that drains population, especially young people. So it's a place that also has seen the rise of extreme politics over time.
This is extreme politics. Their story starts in Yugoslavia, a country in Southeast Europe and Central Europe. It was a country for the most of 20th century. Why most of the 20th century? Because it disintegrated. It was originally called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, primarily populated by, well, obviously, Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes. It was renamed to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929. And in 1963, after the end of the Second World War, it ceased to become a kingdom and became the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. And it had 6 republics within it: Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, and Montenegro. What we saw is that even though there were common strands holding the populations together, such as language, since they all spoke Serbo-Croatian, well, it's a bit more complicated than that because you also have Macedonian and Montenegrin. They could understand each other, but there were certain key differences, one of them being religion. Croats identify as Catholics, Serbs identify as Christian Orthodox, and Bosniaks identify as Muslim. The country was held together by the strongman Josip Broz Tito. He died in 1980. There was already fear in whether Yugoslavia would hold together. In the end, it survived roughly 10 years, but we could already see by the start of 1990s that this is a country of real problems. It was starting to break apart. It really took off in June 1991, where Slovenia and Croatia decided to declare independence. That sparked the start of Yugoslavia War. After the Slovenians and Croatians declared independence, the multi-ethnic state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, at the time composing of Muslim Bosniaks at 44%, Orthodox Serbs at 32.5%, and Catholic Croats at 17%, also passed a referendum for independence on February 29, 1992, seeking international recognition of such a sovereign state in the light of the de facto breakup of the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. The Serbian political leaders, however, were not in favor of this referendum. Therefore, the Assembly of the Serbian people in Bosnia and Herzegovina adopted their own constitution, forming a region called Republika Srpska. Yet, it wasn't as simple as that.
So what happened was that the government of Slobodan Milosevic supported the acts of essentially criminal gangs that came over from Serbia, very heavily armed, and they began seizing territory and expelling usually Muslim, sometimes Croat populations from their towns. There are a number of infamous incidents in which civilians were murdered at gunpoint.
One of which incidents happened in the town of Srebrenica, where 8,372 Bosniak Muslims, men and boys, were killed and 20,000 civilians were expelled.
But the point was to terrorize people and move non-Serbs out of as much territory as possible.
So what about the Croats and the Bosniaks?
Matters were then complicated because the Bosnian Croats then also decided to break away. So it became a 3-part conflict. And that lasted until 1994, when what happened was, under US guidance, the Bosnian Serbs, the Bosnian Croats and the Bosnian Muslims, who we now call Bosniaks, came up with an agreement that they would form their own federal entity as part of Bosnia. And then the following year, after a number of further incidents, what we saw is real pressure to try and get the Bosnian Serbs to also agree.
So what exactly happened to Republika Srpska?
The current configuration of that territory emerged from negotiations in Dayton that took place in the fall of 1995, and it was essentially it was a kind of a compromise between the various sides. So the Croat, the Bosnian Muslim, the Serb side, which carved out some territory, like two kinds of territory. So there's the Bosnian Federation in the south, and this northern area that kind of extends across northern into eastern Bosnia, the Republika Srpska.
Now there were all sorts of other political settlements elements that were included into that. So like a tripartite presidency. So Bosnia actually has three people in its presidency: one who's Muslim, one who is Serbian, and one who's Croatian. And all this was then topped, if you like, by an international figure who came in and had the power of oversight for this agreement. So what we call the High Representative.
So what is Bosnia like these days? After the unimaginably inhumane episode of the war, the demographics have slightly altered. Now, the country is composed of 48% Muslim Bosniaks, 33% Orthodox Serbs, 14% Catholic Croats, and 4.3% others. However, the war in 1992-95 has its roots in its people. When conducting a global politics study in 2019, I surveyed around 200 Bosnian students where they were asked the question of, what is your view on the current political situation in Bosnia? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the most negative and 10 being the most positive, the average was a shocking 2.6. When asked about what might be the underlying reason behind such an existent issue, the top-ranked answer is extreme politicians, and they might be just right. Time traces back to November 2021, where we see headlines that were similar to the ones that were shown in the beginning.
Like loud, very, harsh rhetoric, not hesitating to kind of, insult somebody, to attack journalists, to a very kind of, I would say, sort of a crude Balkan type. He was blacklisted by the U.S. Authorities.
The person Jenna is describing is a man named Milorad Dodik. He is a Bosnian Serb politician serving as the 7th and current Serbian member of the presidency in Bosnia, who has been making claims that are quote-unquote paramount to secession for the entity of Republika Srpska.
I think the best way to describe his kind of, political origins is like he was, in the very beginning, he was very much, perceived as an alternative, to the nationalist parties. Like predominantly Serb nationalist party. So the main nationalist party in Bosnia and Herzegovina that kind of represents the interests of the Serbs is actually the SDS, the Serb Democratic Party, which was one of the main nationalist parties in the first multi-party elections, back in 1991, and they were the party of the wartime leadership, actually political leadership of the Serbs. So Radovan Karadzic, for example, who was the president of Republika Srpska, also belonged to that party, and also Biljana Plavšić, and both of them eventually got kind of, they were tried, at the international court in Den Haag, and so in a way the party was very much incriminated. So the international community has been looking for some kind of partner among this, Serb political leadership, or somebody who could be an alternative to that type of narrative. And the party that he kind of was leading, officially is named SNSD, which stands for the Union of the Independent Social Democrats. So it's effectively, rhetoric was very, very different actually from the rhetoric of the majority of the leadership, not just the Serb leadership, but I would say the leadership of all the nationalist parties in the country. So he became a bit of a darling of the West.
But he's become gradually more and more nationalist, and to the point now that it is actually become a real source of concern, because he's talking quite openly about having, independence for Republika Srpska, which I think is something that is very, very destabilizing in the Bosnian context, because obviously this is a country that's been through war. You've got the Bosniaks who say we didn't fight this war in order now that we could let Republika Srpska go its own way. A lot of people would say he was worried about the way that the Bosniaks were increasingly trying to centralize power. That there were more and more people talking about trying to abolish Republika Srpska. there were also other elements that are important in all of this. So in 2009, the European Court of Human Rights, the most senior court in Europe dealing with human rights issues, said that the Bosnian constitution, as set down under the Dayton Peace Accord in 1995, was actually contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights, because it laid out a tripartite presidency of these three main groups, so the Croats, the Bosniaks, and the Serbs. And the court said that this was discriminatory because the country also contains other groups, small groups, but other groups. And for example, the case was brought by a member of the Jewish community and a member of the Roma community, who were effectively kept out of politics and couldn't serve as the president of their own country because they didn't identify with one of the three main groups. So the European Court of Human Rights said, look, you've got to change your constitution. And at that point, you can imagine what happened. The three communities said, well, look, if we're going to give in on changing the constitution, what do we get out of it? And they all wanted different things and incompatible things. So I think that also complicated matters. But also, I think there is the personal ambition of Dodik as well. We see this in all sorts of situations, that leaders become very comfortable. They don't want to give up their power. And in a country like Bosnia, one of the tried and tested ways that you can retain power is you play on ethnic fear. That you say to people, I am the person who is going to protect you against the encroachments that those Bosniaks want to, they want to get rid of Republika Srpska. They want to take your identity and things. So he plays very much on that. What served as the real catalyst recently is that the previous high representative, so this international figure who was appointed to oversee the agreement, the previous one was just about to leave, and he'd been growing increasingly concerned about accusations of genocide denial in the Bosnian Serb community. But more and more people were saying, look, this didn't happen in Srebrenica. It was all made up. It was over-exaggerated. So he imposed a law making this a criminal offence. So if you deny genocide in Bosnia, then you can go to jail. And Dodik was furious about this. He said that this was a blatantly partisan move. Valentin Inzko, this high representative, was just about to leave. And so Dodik said, right, okay, that's it. I've had it. I'm going to start rescinding all these laws passed by these high representatives because I don't regard them as legitimate figures. And some of the steps he wanted to do would repatriate powers that had been given to the central government over the years from Republika Srpska. And one of those key ones, the key one in many ways, was a decision to recreate a Bosnian Serb army. And in a country which has a history of violence, the thing that you want to do is make sure that you've got an army. So this has now been read by the Bosniaks. This is a real, all the alarm bells are going off now.
This kind of militarization of the police in a way in Republika Srpska, which was also often presented as an issue, like rifled police, some sort of riot gear, equipment, and that was very much presented as this organizing some kind of parades of that police through the streets of Banja Luka, and just kind of presenting that very, very like an authoritarian dictatorship image, where in reality he doesn't possess that kind of power. And so that's why opposition very often sees that as a smoke dragon, it's just it's just him bluffing, and him kind of trying to play with the sentiments of the general public, where in reality there's no really much strong foundations, of any of his claims. So it's hard to tell, really. I mean, how serious is he about some of those things? I sometimes feel that it's not too serious because he also has a tendency of changing his mind. I mean, the EU and US interests are to a certain extent aligned, I think, when it comes to the Balkans, so they do kind of have fairly similar views. Now, some would suggest, of course, for the US, it's more of a strategic imperative of keeping Russia at bay. But still, the US embassy plays an important role, and now with this recent kind of involvement of the US officials, sent by the administration, and like Escobar, like there was sent literally to kind of to sort of pass the U.S. positions. It's really hard to tell, like how important will that be for the United States, and how much will the United States really invest. For Russia, formally Russia is committed to the peace in the country, so they're very like there's not really much rhetoric about anything like supporting separation or secession or anything like that. China is kind of China is kind of growing, I think in terms of its economic presence. So like infrastructural projects in Montenegro, in Croatia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was this big project of the power plant also that was supposed to be built with the help of the Chinese companies, highway construction, Chinese companies involved. So, and China as well, like in a way also, I think, sides with Russia when it comes to criticizing the Western approach to handling the crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but that's pretty much it. And there's, I think, nobody really else. I mean, the neighboring states, Serbia and Croatia, yeah, I mean, like their current leadership is really kind of weird. So you have Zoran Milanovic, who's like whose rhetoric, who's leader of the Social Democratic Party, but has been using some populist rhetoric on his own. And has been, I mentioned Aleksandar Vučić of Serbia as somebody who's like in between when it comes to rhetoric. He's kind of in favor of special relations with the Republika Srpska, of like kind of protection of the Serb interests and all of that, but in the same time always mentions how Serbia is one of the guarantors of the peace and sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it's one of the signatories of the Dayton Peace Agreement, and therefore, is committed to peace and the preservation of the territorial integrity of the country and all of that.
I'd love to be able to tell you what Dodik is planning, but I don't think anyone knows because, again, look, it's not in his interest for there to be a war. Presumably. It could be the case that if there is a war, then he'll claim self-defense, and that this is why Republika Srpska needs to secede. So I suppose there's an option, but I think an act of secession by Republika Srpska would be completely, it would be disastrous. It wouldn't go anywhere. No one's going to recognize it, and no one that is in any position to help Republika Srpska is going to recognize it. So it'll just become another one of the world's de facto states, which it's not a happy and a pretty place to be in.
Honestly, to some extent, I'm positive, because these new generations that are coming, a lot of them think like us in a way, and are chill and are not nationalists in the first place. And I think a lot of the new generations are not concerned with these like national symbols or like war and like this is our territory, this is yours.
Yes. Personally, from my experience, I am born to a Croat father and a Serb mother. I was born and raised in a Bosniak city, and I've never had any problems because I wasn't a Bosniak. Like, the younger generations aren't interested in that, and so many negative things happened in the past because of these ethnic divisions. We finally learned our lessons, that we should overcome them and try to live together.
We are all pondering whether Bosnia is subject to yet another conflict. Is it about to enter an abyss of blood and tears again? Hard to tell. But as everyday citizens of the world, we should all stay informed and alarmed. We want peace in a country, not pieces of a country.